Good evening, everyone. We begin our new study in the book of Daniel. We've put this book away for quite a while, mainly because it presents a lot of challenges in the sense that it is not the usual type of historical narratives that we are familiar with. But since we have just completed the book of Second Kings, it makes a lot of sense for us now to proceed into the book of Daniel, because right after the book of Second Kings, it would be the end of the history of the kingdom of Judah, as we are told. The book of Daniel actually overlaps the last few chapters of the book of Second Kings because it records a time where Jehoiakim was king. So let us recall at the time of Josiah, he met up with Pharaoh Necho in Jezreel, and he died there out of an accident where an arrow was shot at him. After he died, Jehoahaz became king, or they made Jehoahaz king. But Pharaoh Necho didn't like Jehoahaz and brought him to Egypt. And in his place, he put in the son of Josiah by name of Jehoiakim. Now, Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king. And so he was the one who took over from Jehoahaz. It is at his reign that we are most interested. Now, we do know that he reigned for 11 years. So if you plot the number of years down, we would find that to be right here on the 11th year. Now, if this was the first year and all the way down, and so we have the 11th year right at the bottom, right here on the 11th year. So it is important for us then to grapple with the book of Daniel. We will do that once we get into the first few verses. For today, we will begin as an introduction. The book of Daniel has been widely challenged. Many people think that the book of Daniel was actually written very late, probably in the 2nd or 3rd century BCE. But that would have been a problem if you were a Jew. If you were part of Israel at the time of Ezekiel. Now, it's important for us to recognize that in the book of Ezekiel, and I'll put down here, in the book of Ezekiel, in chapter 14 and verse 14, as well as in chapter 28 and in verse 3. These two passages in the book of Ezekiel mentions Daniel. And that would be a great testimony that Daniel is really a contemporary of Ezekiel. Now, Ezekiel lived amongst the people. Daniel was in the royalties, meaning he was in the palace. He was there at the top with all the kings. Daniel had a totally different role altogether. Now, Ezekiel, on the other hand, was a prophet, and he gave a lengthy stretch of prophecies all the way to 48 chapters. And the last 8 chapters or thereabouts speaks of a temple where it is going to be very different, and it's commonly understood as the 3rd temple, not even the 2nd, the 3rd temple. And so I just want to draw our attention that the book of Daniel is special, is unique, but it is not late. It is early. But most importantly, there are a couple of things that we do need to talk about, mainly because of the unique character of the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel comprises of 12 chapters. And when we begin the book of Daniel, at least for the first 7 chapters, we find that uh, Daniel is recorded in the third person. Now, third person means that somebody else is recording the conversations, the narratives, and the comments. When it comes to chapter 8, then we find that it is as if Daniel wrote it himself. And so he writes it in the first person as he sees, and thereby gives us two different profiles of the book. The first 7 chapters in the third person, and the next 5 chapters in the first person. So that's one particular uniqueness. The second uniqueness will be interesting when we get to chapter 2 of the book of Daniel. And from the start of the book of Daniel, it begins in the Hebrew language and it ends in the Hebrew language. Now, one of the interesting things that you would find uh, is this. From Daniel chapter 1 till Daniel chapter 2, verse 3, it is actually a historical narrative that is always, as in all the books of the Hebrew Bible, written in Hebrew. And then in Daniel chapter 2, verse 4 onwards, records all the conversations in Aramaic, and basically preserving the conversation and not translating the conversation as much. When we come to Daniel chapter 8, where it is written in the first person and it is all a historical narrative style, then you find that all of the few chapters from chapter 8 all the way to the end is written in the form of the Hebrew. And so right in the middle, you find a good 7 chapters uh, in the Aramaic language. And so these are some of the unique characteristics of the book of Daniel. As such, it is not as simple a book to just read through. Now, obviously, when you read the English text, you don't find the complications. And much of the translations have covered up or concealed the underlying language. When you read the book of Daniel, as in a typical translation of the Bible, you find that the characters of the books of the Bible seems to be speaking in English all the time. And so we don't actually see any challenges. But I would like to point out to you right from the start of the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, as we move along, we do find a number of challenges. And our objective in this particular study in series 2 is to uncover as much of the underlying language and its challenges, both in Hebrew as well as in the Aramaic, so that we get to understand the intent and the meaning of the original writer and speaker. And we will do that as we go along. It will be one of the rare occasions where we get to study the book of Daniel like this, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, and in some cases, word by word if we need to, or we will analyze some of the words because that will help us understand the intent of the original writer, both in the Hebrew and in the Aramaic. Now, with that said, many people don't think that the book of Daniel amounts to much. Now, in the minds of the Israelites and the Jews today, they don't really care what other people think because it is part and parcel of their Bible, the Hebrew Bible, which they call the Tanakh. It is also found in our English translations, part of the Old Testament, and the book of Daniel is found in a category called the minor prophets. Now, why do the classification goes this way, the major and the minor prophets? And I guess fundamentally, it is to help us understand that the major prophets, it's not because they are talking about major prophecies, and the minor prophets talks about minor prophecy. That's not the case. It is about the length of the books. So the major prophets are the ones that speaks the longest, and the minor prophets are the ones who speaks the least. That's about the only reason why the categorization exists. It is nothing to do with importance of the revelation or the speech the various prophets would have said. Now, the book of Daniel doesn't fall into the category of prophets in the Hebrew Bible. It falls into the category of writings, the Ketuvim, and it's classified together with the book of Psalms. Daniel uh, is not seen as a prophet per se, not like Ezekiel, not like Isaiah, or even Jeremiah for that matter. Daniel is seen as a very important person in the history of the Jews, the Jewish people, particularly when we read the book of Daniel in the exile, and we see that Daniel himself takes a very important role to look after the interest of the Jewish exiles in the land of Babylon. And so Daniel is seen as that kind. He doesn't go and speak to the people and warn them. He does give a number of prophecies because of what he has seen, and he writes it down, but he is not the prophet that God sends to remind the people, rebuke the people, exhort the people, and chastise the people like the typical prophets of Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Hosea, Jeremiah, and even Ezekiel, a contemporary of Daniel. And so, with that said, I hope we have a better understanding that the book of Daniel is not classified as a prophet category in the Hebrew Bible, although in the English translations it is classified together with the minor prophets because of the shortness of the book rather than the importance of the content. Now, when we get to the arguments against the book of Daniel, I just want to assure you that, like I said, the Jews don't really care what other people think about the book of Daniel. It is well understood and appreciated when the book of Daniel begins in the third person. Daniel did not write it, but it's not important. For example, in the book or the scroll of Samuel, well, Samuel didn't write all of it either, because Samuel dies towards the later part of the book of First Samuel. And so there were other prophets who completed that scroll named Samuel. And same thing here in this scroll called Daniel. Daniel didn't write all of it, and it's not a big deal at all, not even a concern. What is written in the text is more important to verify than an actual author that we can name. And that is something which the Jews have no problem with, but many opponents of the book of Daniel may raise this as an issue. Again, as I had mentioned, the Jews knows Ezekiel chapter 14, Ezekiel chapter 28, and it mentions Daniel and is good enough for them. And hence the book of Daniel is very important in our part of the study to continue in the continuation of the history of the Jewish people from right before the final exile. And then later on, we will cover the post exilic books again. Today, when we begin, let us do an introduction and we will cover the first two verses of the book of Daniel. And as I had mentioned, the challenges begins even from the first chapter and the first verse itself. Daniel chapter 1 verse 1 begins this way. It says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and then this is the and he besieged it. And so let us take a look at some of these words. It tells us here is in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, and we have Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. He came and took siege of the city of Jerusalem. And so the siege is not in the country, but is on the city. Now, the city of Jerusalem is also where the palace of the king would be. So it would make sense for Nebuchadnezzar to actually put it on siege. Now, we begin by understanding a few things. Nebuchadnezzar, as we are told, was king in the fourth year of Jehoiakim. And this would be recorded in Jeremiah chapter 25 and in verse 1. Now, there are many opinions, and I'm going to give you mine in my study, that this is not really the third year as we see on the screen here. It's not this third year. We also take note that in the fourth year of Jehoiakim, we have Nebuchadnezzar here. And he became king only in the fourth year of Jehoiakim. So what do we actually know? Well, we know a few things. We know that in 2 Kings, and this will be 2 Kings chapter 23 and in verse 36, as well as 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and in verse 5. These are important chapters that we should pay attention. And we are told that the reign of Jehoiakim was actually 11 years. And so when we read this in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, we can't see Nebuchadnezzar coming on the scene because he was king in the fourth year. Now that's a problem in itself. So how does Nebuchadnezzar come about before he became king? Now, some people suggest that the third year is really the fourth year. Depends on how you're going to count all these years. But I would leave that to you. I'm suggesting that the fourth year is the fourth year, the third year is the third year. And so the third year in the reign of the king of Judah, Jehoiakim, is not this third year. Not this third year here. Now, what do we learn? And we learn this quite quickly. In 2 Kings chapter 4, right? 24. 2 Kings chapter 24 and in verse 1. 2 Kings chapter 4 and in verse 1 tells us that in the days Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jehoiakim, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. Now, this is where we need to really be a bit smarter when we look at numbers. We have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And so we have 3 years here. And Nebuchadnezzar came to attack Jehoiakim here in his 5th year and made him a vassal for 3 years. Now, what is a vassal? A vassal means he is subservient to King Nebuchadnezzar, which also tells us this, that in the first 5 years is under Egypt. Why? Is because of Josiah fighting with Pharaoh Necho and leads all the way down to Jehoiakim. And so for the first 5 years, he was a vassal of the king of Egypt. And then for the next 3 years, he was under the vassal of Babylon. Now, what happened is this. For 3 more years, right here, he was an independent. Now, what does that mean? It means that he is not with Egypt, neither was he with Babylon. Because in chapter 24, 2 Kings chapter 24, and in verse 1, the last part says this. Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years, and then he turned and rebelled against Babylon, which is here. So after 3 years, Jehoiakim says, I want to be king for myself. And so what actually happened, we are told now, in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, the 3 years, or in the 3rd year, really means this. 1, 2, 3. He had 3 years of independence, and in that 3rd year of independence, King Nebuchadnezzar came to fight against Judah and besieged Jerusalem. And so we can now safely say this is the 3rd year of the independent reign of Jehoiakim. These 3 years, 3 independent years, and that's what we are trying to say, right? 3 independent years. And in the 3rd year, the king of Babylon came and besieged Jerusalem. Now that is to clear up some of these things. Now, these dates sometimes can be challenging because we need to have a clear background of the history. If we didn't do 2 Kings, we won't be able to grapple with this. And so now in the book of Daniel, it overlaps with 2 Kings chapter 24, which is also 2 Chronicles chapter 36. And so we need to understand that by looking at this, we can actually see the completion of 11 years of Jehoiakim. First 5 of the years, it is with Egypt. The next 3 of the years, it is with Babylon. The final 3 of his 11 years, he was independent. And at the third year, Nebuchadnezzar came and took its siege. Now, we are not told how long it was in siege, but in Daniel chapter 1, verse 2, it begins this way. And now, this word here is and then. And then the Lord, and here the Lord is not Jehovah, it is Adonai. And Adonai handed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, over to Nebuchadnezzar. This word handed literally means gave. This is the Hebrew word. God gave Jehoiakim into the hands of the king of Babylon. Now, the king of Babylon is not your friendliest and nicest king. He is the most brutal. When we read at the end of Second Kings, you find that he was so brutal that he would capture Zedekiah, capture his children, his sons, killed the sons in front of Zedekiah, and then gorged out his eyes so that his son's death was the last thing he saw, and then took Zedekiah to Babylon. He is that brutal a king. But God gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, over to him because Jehoiakim was also doing evil in the eyes of God. That's important. And so once God gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, over to Babylon, we can safely understand that there is nothing much Jehoiakim can do. We can also safely assume that the battle was over quite quickly. And once that was over, we are now told, and we can actually see from other passages as well, that the king of Babylon, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, meaning the temple, he took them and then he brought them to the land of Shinar. Now, understand this. The land of Shinar, we read this in Genesis chapter 11. After they came out of the ark, they went east to the land of Shinar, and the land of Shinar is Babylon. And Babylon is where King Nebuchadnezzar is. His palace is there. And he brought all the vessels of the temple of God to the land of Shinar, and he put it in the house of his God. Now, this word, his house, the house of his God, literally means, well, we can say that it was in the temple or the place where they worship. So the house of his God is in the land of Shinar, and in the house of his God, he brought the vessels and put it into the storehouse. And this word here is treasury. It's also a good word. It's a place where they keep all the precious things. The supply house, the warehouse, the storehouse, right? The storehouse of his God, in the house of his God. Now, this is something which I think we need to be clear. God has demonstrated that he was in the verge of giving up the entire kingdom of Judah. This is but the first. Now, the reason why it's been in these number of phases, because after Jehoiakim, there is Jehoiakim, and then there was Zedekiah. Why is there such a process? I would suggest to us that this process, that Nebuchadnezzar did not come and just destroyed everything. was one, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't as powerful yet because he was just king not long. He took over from his father. So remember, he became king in the fourth year, right here, of Jehoiakim. But now we're talking about right here at the end of his reign, at the end of his 11 years reign, which is the third year of his independent reign, everything collapsed. And it is important why there are phases was to give Judah a chance to repent. God could have just destroyed everything and allowed Nebuchadnezzar to ruin everything in Judah. But God did not allow him to do just that. So in this case, it was just taking over some of the vessels. But at the time of Zedekiah, the temple was burnt down. And that was what we read at the end of Second Kings. And so during this time of this particular siege to the last siege where the temple was burned down, there was a fairly long period of time of at least another 11 years. So the reason for God to, I guess we can say, drag it out for the kingdom of Judah is to give them time to repent. But what we did see in the book of Second Kings was this. Josiah was a good king. Jehoiakim for 3 months, Pharaoh Necho took him out, put Jehoiakim as king, as a vassal for 5 years to Egypt. Then Nebuchadnezzar came and made Jehoiakim and Judah the vassal to Babylon for 3 years. And after 3 years, Jehoiakim decided he's just going to be his own king for another 3 years. And here in the third year, Nebuchadnezzar just came in and took siege and conquered Jerusalem, but did not destroy Jerusalem because in place, we had a few. We have Jehoiakim, the son of Jehoiakim, for 3 months. And then Babylon king Nebuchadnezzar put Zedekiah in place for another 11 years. So there is a period of time, but as we read in the history books in Second Kings, from chapters 24, 25, we do find that there was at no time the kings ever wanted to repent. We kept reading, they did evil in the eyes of God. And so what we see in Daniel chapter 1, verse 2 is indications that God is giving up on Judah and will be final if the kings do not repent. And so after Jehoiakim was Jehoiakim for 3 months and Zedekiah for 11 years. Now we will return back to Zedekiah because we would need to calibrate with his reign when we get to Daniel chapter 2. And with this, we come to the end of our session today as part of the introduction to the book of Daniel, and we will continue with verse 3 tomorrow.